They Googled it on my own laptop, my own daughter. How long can 80-year-olds live? She didn't even clear the search history, didn't even close the tab. I saw it by accident, or maybe I was supposed to. Maybe she wanted me to see it, the way people leave the lights on in a room they want someone to walk into, just to make a point. I remember staring at the screen and feeling the strangest thing, not anger, not even shock. Just this cold, precise awareness that something between us had quietly died while I wasn't looking. I'm 81 now. I live in a small stucco house in Tampa, the kind of place with lemon trees out front and too much light in the mornings. It's not assisted living, not yet. I still drive, though only to the pharmacy and the market. I still cook, even if it's just for one. And most days, I still think of myself as the woman I used to be. Capable, organized, sensible. But that night, with the laptop humming and the cursor blinking on that question, how long can 80-year-olds live? I understood that my own child had begun to measure me in years left, not years lived. It's a strange thing, realizing you've turned into someone's countdown. She had come down from Raleigh for a week after my hip surgery. I thought it was kindness. She brought her youngest, 14, polite but restless, always half inside a phone screen. The first day was sweet. She made soup, tidied the pantry, replaced the batteries in the smoke detectors. The second day, she started commenting on things. How my fridge was too full, how my car was too old, how my neighborhood wasn't safe for seniors. The third day, she asked about my will. By the fifth, she'd rearranged the furniture for better flow. I told myself she was just being helpful, that the condescension in her voice was fatigue, not impatience. I even smiled when she said, "You really shouldn't be alone, Mom." But the smile didn't reach anywhere real. It stopped at my teeth. The day I found the Google search, she was in the shower. I'd gone to check my email. The page was open already, the tab still active. A list of results about mortality rates, life expectancy tables, estate planning for elderly parents. There was even a sponsored link that said, "Prepare your loved ones before it's too late." I stared at that line for a long time. Too late for what? For love? For honesty? For decency? She'd forgotten to delete it. And in a way, that forgetfulness said everything. She thought I wouldn't notice. Or worse, she thought it didn't matter if I did. I remember the light in the kitchen that morning. It was that milky Florida light, soft but too revealing, the kind that makes dust visible on every surface. She came out of the bathroom humming, wrapped in one of my towels, her hair pinned up like she still lived here, and asked if I wanted oatmeal or toast. I said, oatmeal. She smiled, too wide. There was a gentleness to it that made my skin crawl, a kindness rehearsed for the sake of guilt. When she turned away to get the milk, I looked at her and saw her not as my daughter, but as a stranger rehearsing the role of someone she used to love. It's not that I was perfect. I wasn't the soft kind of mother. I was practical, maybe too practical. I worked double shifts when her father left, paid off the house early, saved for her college, never missed a birthday. But I wasn't sentimental. I didn't say I love you every time I hung up the phone. I thought showing up was enough. Maybe that was my mistake. Maybe she wanted a mother who wept more, who shared recipes and secrets, not one who mailed checks and advice. Still, I never imagined she would one day look at me as a liability, something to be managed, not loved. That night, after she went to bed, I opened the laptop again. The glow of the screen lit up the room like a secret. I scrolled through her other searches. How to get power of attorney for elderly parent. Best memory care facilities, Florida. Early signs of dementia. I closed the lid quietly, afraid even the sound of it might betray me. I sat there for a long time, listening to the air conditioner breathe in and out, and I felt this hollow, steady ache in my chest. It wasn't heartbreak. It was clarity. I understood that the conversation we'd been avoiding was already happening, just not with me. In the morning, she made coffee and asked how I slept. I lied and said fine. She looked relieved, as if my calmness confirmed something for her. Maybe that I wouldn't make a scene. She'd always hated scenes. When she was a teenager, I once scolded her in front of her friends for skipping class, and she didn't speak to me for 2 days. Even then, she cared more about appearances than truth. Now, decades later, that same instinct guided her hand across my life. She wanted to manage me quietly, gracefully, like closing a door without making noise. I tried to remember when the balance between us had shifted. Maybe it was the year she started calling me by my first name in restaurants. Maybe it was when she began talking to doctors over me instead of to me. Or maybe it was the small, invisible moments. Her hand hovering near my elbow when we crossed the street. The way she repeated my words to waiters so they wouldn't get confused. At first, I thought it was affection, an exaggerated care. Now I know it was a rehearsal for authority. After she left that Sunday, I cleaned the house slowly, deliberately. I changed the sheets, wiped down the counters, rearranged the chairs she'd moved. I tried to reclaim the space molecule by molecule. In the corner of the dining room, there was a stack of pamphlets she'd left behind. Choosing the right senior community. When parents need help making decisions. Safe steps, avoiding falls and financial mistakes. I didn't throw them out. I stacked them neatly in a drawer, a kind of archive of her intentions. That evening, I went out to water the lemon tree. The sky was fading from gold to lavender, and the air smelled faintly of salt. My neighbor, June, waved from her porch, holding her little dog. "How's your daughter?" she called. I smiled and said, "She's fine." Then I added, almost to myself, "She's practical." June laughed. "That's good. Practical daughters are a blessing." I nodded, even though I wasn't sure anymore what kind of blessing it was to be seen only in terms of practicality. Inside, I sat at the kitchen table with the laptop again. I opened a blank document and typed, "How long can 80-year-olds live?" The search results were the same, but the question felt different. It wasn't hers anymore. It was mine now. I wasn't looking for an answer in numbers. I was looking for permission to still exist beyond the expiration date someone else had imagined for me. Sometimes I wonder if she understands what that search really meant. Maybe she didn't mean it cruelly. Maybe it was fear. Maybe she looked at me and saw her own future. Fragile, finite, and too close for comfort. Maybe she Googled it not because she wanted me gone, but because she needed to believe there was still time before she became me. But intent doesn't erase the wound. Some betrayals don't come with shouting or slammed doors. They arrive softly, in polite tones, through questions that sound like care but taste like goodbye. Now, whenever I open my laptop, I feel the ghost of that sentence hovering beneath the surface. I've changed the background, the passwords, the homepage, but still, it lingers. A reminder of how love can calcify into management, how easily affection turns into audit. I tell myself it's better to know, better to see the truth, however small, however cruel, because once you've seen it, you can't go back to pretending. And maybe that's its own kind of freedom. So yes, she Googled how long 80-year-olds live. I suppose she found an answer somewhere. 10 years, maybe 12 if you're healthy. But what she'll never understand is that survival isn't measured in years. It's measured in awareness. And the night I saw that search, I didn't just wake up to her betrayal. I woke up to my own life, the part of it that still belongs only to me. The catalyst came the morning after the Google discovery, though it didn't arrive as a single event or confrontation, but as a slow, deliberate rearrangement of the air between us. I woke early, before sunrise, and sat in the living room, where the light was pale and hesitant, the kind that makes everything appear softer than it really is. The house smelled faintly of disinfectant and overbrewed coffee. My daughter, Marianne, was already awake, dressed neatly in one of her trim linen blouses, her hair still damp from the shower. She was talking on the phone in that clipped professional tone she used when she didn't want me to know what the conversation was about. I could hear fragments. Yes, power of attorney. No, just exploring options. Of course, only if necessary. When she noticed me in the doorway, she smiled too quickly, that rehearsed curve of lips that doesn't quite reach the eyes. "Morning, Mom. I was just checking in with the insurance company. They're updating some policies for you. Don't worry, I'll handle it." She said it as if it were an act of mercy, as if my confusion were an established fact, not an assumption she had quietly signed into existence. After she hung up, she began clearing the breakfast table even though we hadn't eaten yet. She had that restless, managerial energy of someone who needs constant motion to avoid stillness. "We should talk about a few things while I'm here," she said, stacking plates with an efficient clatter. "Nothing serious, just planning ahead. I know you hate these talks, but it's better to have them now, while you're still feeling good." I wanted to ask, good compared to what? Compared to the day she expects me to forget my own name? Compared to the day she signs papers for me and calls it love? But I only nodded, because resistance with her always turned into evidence, proof that I was being difficult, emotional, unreasonable. She set down the plates and looked at me the way people look at a car that's still running but leaking oil. "You've done so much on your own, Mom, but things are getting more complicated these days. Bills, maintenance, the yard, all those online forms. It's not sustainable." She opened a folder she'd brought with her and began laying out documents on the table. Everything she did had an air of performance, even the way she aligned the papers in perfect symmetry. "This," she said, tapping one page with her manicured nail, "is just a basic financial overview. I've been helping other families with this through work, and it makes things simpler for everyone." She spoke like a lawyer, not a daughter, careful and neutral, avoiding words like control or authority, wrapping them instead in soft phrases like assistance, coordination, and protection. I sat there watching her, listening to the rhythm of her voice, and I realized she'd already decided. The conversation was only a formality, a polite way of informing me of my own demotion in the hierarchy of my life. She showed me a document titled Durable Power of Attorney. Her tone brightened as she explained how convenient it would be, how it would reduce the stress of decision-making for me. I looked at her face, her smooth, practiced smile, and for a moment, I saw the little girl she used to be, the one who used to braid my hair on Sunday mornings, who used to run barefoot through the garden, who used to believe that my strength was limitless. That image flashed and vanished, replaced by the woman sitting across from me now, a woman who had learned to confuse control with care. "I don't need this," I said quietly. "Not yet." She sighed as if I'd proven her point. "Mom, this isn't about need. It's about preparation. You've always been responsible. You taught me that. This is just the responsible thing to do." Her voice had that soft edge of manipulation I'd grown to recognize over the years, the tone that makes you doubt your own instincts. I wanted to tell her that being prepared doesn't mean surrendering your autonomy, that love isn't about signatures and notarized forms, but the words got tangled somewhere between defiance and fatigue. I had spent so many years making decisions for others that when it came time to defend my own, I hesitated. She took my silence as consent. "Good," she said, gathering the papers. "I'll have this ready by tomorrow. We'll just need to stop by the notary." She smiled as though she'd won a small, necessary battle against chaos. After she left for the store, I sat alone at the kitchen table, the documents still warm from her hands. The air conditioner clicked on, humming softly, and I felt that low tremor in my chest again. Not fear exactly, but recognition. The kind of knowing that arrives when the illusion finally collapses. I walked to the sink, turned on the tap, and ran water over my wrists until the coolness steadied me. I had trusted her my whole life, sometimes more than she deserved. I had believed her judgment even when it bruised me. But that morning, something in me hardened, a quiet internal click that said, "Not anymore." Later that afternoon, she returned from the store with new curtains and a bag of groceries I hadn't asked for. She talked about how cheerful the kitchen would look once we brightened it up, how she'd found a better brand of calcium supplements for me, how she'd updated my phone to make it easier to reach her. Every kindness came with an invisible leash. She moved through my house with proprietary ease, opening drawers, checking expiration dates, replacing my old labels with her new systems. When I asked her to sit and rest, she said she couldn't. Too much to do. Too little time. It was as if my home had turned into a workspace, and I was just another task on her list. That evening, we had dinner together, chicken soup and toast. She told me she'd been researching facilities, just in case. Something happened. She said it casually, but her eyes flicked up to gauge my reaction. I swallowed a spoonful of soup that suddenly tasted of salt and metal. "You mean nursing homes?" I asked. She shook her head quickly. "Not nursing homes, Mom. They're called retirement communities now. Very comfortable, very safe." The words safe and comfortable landed like warnings, the vocabulary of gentle exile. I said nothing, and in that silence, she seemed almost relieved, as though she preferred the quiet compliance to any honest resistance. After dinner, she offered to help me sort through my medications. She pulled out the bottles, lined them up like soldiers, and began reading the labels out loud, checking for duplicates, crossing off expiration dates. When she found a small bottle of sleeping pills, she frowned. "These are too strong for someone your age." Her voice was firm now, stripped of any pretense of affection. "I'll dispose of them." She placed the bottle in her purse without waiting for my answer. It was such a small act, barely worth noticing, but it was the first time she physically removed something from me without permission. That was the real catalyst, the quiet theft that told me everything else would follow if I let it. That night, after she'd gone to bed, I walked into the kitchen and opened the pantry. The labels she'd rearranged stared back at me like a catalog of my own erasure. I closed the door, turned off the lights, and sat at the table in the dark. The refrigerator hummed behind me, rhythmic and impersonal. I thought about all the years I had spent building a life defined by competence, balancing budgets, fixing leaky faucets, surviving widowhood without asking for help, and how, in the span of 1 week, my own daughter had rewritten me as someone fragile and fading. That was the betrayal. Not that she wanted to help, but that she no longer saw me as capable of wanting anything at all. The next morning, she announced we'd be visiting a retirement consultant. I told her I had an appointment of my own, which wasn't true, but it bought me time. After she left, I called my bank, my insurance provider, and my lawyer, the old one, the one who had drafted my will after my husband died. I asked for information, not action. I needed to understand where my lines of defense still existed. The woman on the phone was polite, but brisk. "Do you suspect financial abuse, ma'am?" she asked. The word abuse stung. "No," I said. "Just misunderstanding." But even as I said it, I knew it was something else. When Marianne returned that afternoon, she seemed lighter, almost cheerful, as though some invisible weight had lifted from her shoulders. "I spoke with someone about future planning," she said. "They can visit next week if you're open to it." I looked at her and smiled faintly. "Next week sounds fine." She took it as agreement. What she didn't know was that by next week everything would change. That was the true beginning. The quiet moment when I stopped waiting to be protected and started preparing to protect myself. Betrayal, I've learned, doesn't shout. It whispers in the language of care, hides inside well-meaning gestures, wears the mask of responsibility, and when it comes from your own blood, it doesn't break you all at once. It unthreads you slowly, thread by thread, until you finally stand up and say, "Enough." The first escalation didn't come with an argument or a slammed door. It arrived disguised as accommodation, in the quiet way storms sometimes start, with a change in air pressure before the first drop of rain falls. I told Marianne I would go along with her research, that I would look into options, using her own words so she could feel in control, and she softened immediately. It was almost maternal, the way she patted my hand and said, "See? We're just being sensible." That word again, sensible. The word people use when they're about to make something smaller than it used to be. She went out that day, and I watched her drive away through the blinds, her silver car turning the corner with that sharp confidence of people who have never been left behind. I waited until the sound of the engine disappeared before I exhaled. Then I walked to the small cabinet by the window and pulled out my old address book, the one bound in faded red leather that she'd once called antique, meaning useless. My hands trembled slightly as I turned the pages, not from weakness, but from an odd exhilaration. It felt like touching the pulse of my former self, the woman who used to know things, arrange things, make things happen. I found the number I was looking for. Mr. Delaney, my lawyer from years ago. His office was still there, the same line, the same receptionist with the careful voice. I told her I needed to update some documents, nothing urgent, just clarity. She offered me an appointment 2 days later. I wrote it down on the back of a grocery list. That night, I let Marianne talk. She loved to talk when she felt triumphant. Over dinner, she described the amenities of a community in Raleigh: gardens, on-site medical staff, art classes, even a shuttle to the mall. "You'd have people around you, Mom," she said, her voice dipped in honey. "You wouldn't be isolated." I nodded and asked polite questions. How much did it cost? Was there a waiting list? Could I bring my own furniture? She looked relieved that I was engaging. But underneath her enthusiasm was a calculation I could almost see. a quiet tallying of time and inheritance, of logistics and peace of mind. It wasn't that she was cruel. Cruelty requires intention. Hers was something colder, more practical, a kind of emotional cost-benefit analysis. Later, when she went to bed, I took out my small notebook and began listing the things I would take if I left this house. It was not a plan yet, only an instinct, a preparation for movement. The list was short. Clothes, papers, photos, the gold locket my mother gave me when I turned 20. Everything else could stay. Things, I realized, were anchors, and I was done being anchored. I wrote until the clock struck midnight, then hid the notebook under the mattress, the way I used to hide money from my late husband when he went through his reckless phase. There was something familiar in the secrecy, something that made me feel alert again, almost young. The next day, Marianne accompanied me to my doctor's appointment. She insisted on coming in just to help remember what he says. During the consultation, she interrupted twice, correcting my answers, supplying details I hadn't forgotten, but hadn't been allowed to finish speaking. The doctor looked from her to me with that cautious smile reserved for family dynamics, best left undisturbed. When he asked how I was feeling overall, I said, "Fine. Better every week." Marianne added, "She's being modest. She gets confused sometimes about her medications." I looked at her, then, truly looked, and realized how easily a narrative can be rewritten while you're sitting right there, breathing, fully aware, and yet somehow overwritten by another voice. I wanted to protest, but the doctor just nodded and made a note on his tablet. I understood then that silence, if left too long, turns into confirmation. After the appointment, she suggested lunch. I declined, saying I was tired. She looked disappointed, maybe even suspicious. When we got home, I went to my room and closed the door, something I hadn't done in years. The act of closing it felt like reclaiming a small republic. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the door, the pale light seeping through the crack at the bottom. My house was still mine on paper, but already she moved through it as if ownership had shifted, as if she were only waiting for the formal handover. That afternoon, while she made phone calls in the living room, I retrieved a small metal cash box from the closet, the one where I used to keep emergency savings. Inside were old receipts, a few $100s in bills, and a bank statement I hadn't shown anyone in years, a small account I'd opened after my husband died, money from freelance bookkeeping I'd done for a neighbor's business. Nothing large, but enough for options. I placed it in a tote bag with my notebook. The bag felt heavy and reassuring against my leg. When she called me for dinner, her voice was sweet, but her words were precise. "Mom, I found an opening at a place near us. They have a room available next month. I could come down, help you pack, maybe drive up together." She said it like she was offering a vacation, not relocation. I smiled and said we'd discuss it in the morning. She seemed pleased, mistaking my calm for surrender. That night, I couldn't sleep. I walked through the house barefoot, touching the backs of chairs, the cool marble of the kitchen counter, the edge of the piano I hadn't played since Derek died. Every object carried a weight of memory that felt both precious and suffocating. I paused by the hallway mirror. My reflection startled me, not because of age, but because of the clarity in my eyes. I hadn't seen that look in years. It was the look of a woman deciding. In the morning, I made her favorite breakfast, pancakes with blueberries. She took it as an olive branch, her mood light and chatty. "You'll love it there, Mom," she said between bites. "You'll make friends. They even have a bridge club." I laughed softly, not at the image, but at her certainty. "It sounds lovely," I said. "Maybe I should visit first." She lit up. "That's a great idea. I'll arrange a tour." But what I meant was something different. I wanted to visit my own past, to walk in the direction of the life I'd built before she began dismantling it. When she went out for errands, I dressed carefully in slacks and a pale blouse, the kind that didn't draw attention. I took the tote bag and drove to Mr. Delaney's office. He was older now, thinner, but his handshake was firm, his eyes clear. He remembered me. "Updating your will?" he asked, as though we'd only spoken last month. "Yes," I said, "and some other documents." We discussed the revisions in low, measured tones. I didn't change much, only added a clause removing financial authority from anyone without my explicit consent, and a note about medical decisions. He read it, nodded slowly, and said, "You're wise to do this while everything's in your hands." I wanted to laugh at that. Everything in my hands felt like sand. But still, it was mine. When I got home, Marianne was back. She was in the living room, sorting my mail into 2 piles, hers and mine. "Where were you?" she asked, casual but too controlled. "Just out," I said. "I needed some air." She nodded, but her eyes flicked toward my bag. "You shouldn't be driving so much yet," she murmured. "Your hip needs more rest." I smiled and said, "It's stronger than you think." She didn't answer. That evening, she poured herself a glass of wine and began talking about simplifying things. She used phrases like transitional stage and peace of mind. I listened, stirring my tea, and realized that she truly believed she was doing good. That's what made it so dangerous. The moral confidence of someone who thinks their control is love. I wondered what story she told herself about me. That I was lonely? That I was lost? That she was saving me from decline? People like her need to see themselves as saviors. Otherwise, they'd have to confront what they're really taking. After she went to bed, I opened my notebook again and wrote, "Tomorrow I go to the bank. Ask about safety deposit boxes. Move documents." My handwriting was shaky but deliberate. I closed the notebook and placed it beside the lamp. The next morning, she left early for a meeting. I watched her car disappear, then drove to the bank. The teller, a young woman with bright eyes, smiled kindly when I asked about renting a box. She didn't treat me like I was fragile. She spoke to me as an equal, and that simple courtesy made me want to weep. I placed my new legal documents, my insurance policy, and the deed to the house inside the metal drawer. When I locked it, I felt a pulse of relief so sharp it almost hurt. The house was silent when I returned. I walked from room to room, touching the edges of things that were once part of my life and now felt like artifacts. The afternoon light filtered through the blinds, striping the floor in gold. For the first time in weeks, the silence didn't scare me. It steadied me. I brewed a pot of tea, sat by the window, and thought about all the years I had mistaken endurance for love. That was the first escalation, really. Not the threats or the plans or the papers, but the quiet, private shift inside me when I stopped waiting to be cared for and started remembering how to care for myself. By the time she came back that evening, cheerful and oblivious, I had already begun to plan my departure. Not out of bitterness, but necessity. There is a certain kind of survival that begins not with running, but with watching, with knowing that every smile conceals a boundary being tested. I smiled too, poured her a glass of wine, and asked about her day. She talked about the traffic, the cost of groceries, the weather. I nodded, memorizing her rhythm, her assumptions, her certainty that I was safely folded into her design. She didn't notice the small, growing distance in my eyes, the way I was already walking away in silence. That night, before bed, I stood again at the window. Outside, the lemon tree swayed gently in the warm breeze. Its leaves caught the moonlight like small coins. I thought of all the years I'd pruned it, watered it, waited for it to bear fruit. It always did, stubbornly, quietly, without fanfare. I realized I was not so different. I would survive this too, not through confrontation or forgiveness, but through quiet persistence. By the time the first lemons ripened again, I would be gone. The midpoint came quietly, without ceremony, the way dawn slips into the world before you realize the sky has changed. I didn't plan to take back my life that week, but it was as if some invisible thread snapped and I was suddenly walking toward myself again after years of being turned in the wrong direction. It began on a Thursday, the day Marianne left for a quick business trip. She stood in the hallway with her suitcase, crisp and efficient, reminding me of medication schedules and emergency contacts, her tone both loving and managerial. She spoke as if I were a patient in her care rather than the woman who once ironed her school uniforms and stayed awake all night when she had the measles. I smiled, nodded, and assured her I would be fine. "Don't worry," I said. "I'll be right here when you get back." What she didn't know was that I had no intention of being exactly there. Not in that role. Not in that state of quiet captivity that she mistook for safety. When the door closed and her car disappeared down the street, the silence that followed was enormous, almost holy. It was the first silence that belonged to me in months. I spent the morning walking through the house, not as an occupant, but as a witness. I looked at the way she'd rearranged the living room, how the family photographs were reduced to one tasteful frame, how my old armchair had been replaced by a minimalist white piece that looked like something meant to be admired, not used. I saw my life translated into her aesthetic of control, everything neutral, simplified, lifeless. I realized that if I stayed, soon I would become another object in that design, something to be managed, sanitized, and explained away. Around noon, I opened my notebook and drew a line down the middle of a page. On one side, I wrote, "What she sees," and on the other, "What I know." Under her side, I listed the labels she had assigned me: fragile, forgetful, dependent, sweet. Under mine, I wrote the words she didn't remember: capable, stubborn, educated, exacting. I stared at the two columns until the paper blurred. Then I closed the book and said out loud to the empty room, "Enough." The next morning I woke early, dressed neatly, and drove to the small cafe on the corner of Orange Avenue, a place I hadn't visited in years. The same woman owned it, though older now, her hair whiter and her laughter quieter. She greeted me with a familiarity that felt like oxygen. I sat by the window with a cup of coffee that tasted more like freedom than caffeine and began to think. It wasn't about escape, not exactly. It was about restoration, about claiming a life that had been gradually stolen through the politeness of good intentions. I made a list of practical steps. Find a smaller apartment, move the essential documents, set up automatic bill payments under my own supervision, and inform Mr. Delaney that any new legal requests would need my personal signature. Each item steadied me, not because I expected it to be easy, but because for the first time in years, every line of ink on that page belonged entirely to my will. When I returned home, the house felt different, not larger, but emptier, as if her presence had left a residue I could finally see clearly. I began cleaning not to maintain order, but to reclaim territory. I opened drawers and threw out half the things she had labeled for efficiency. I put my old chair back in the corner by the window, draped it with my faded blue shawl, and sat there for an hour doing nothing but breathing. The afternoon light fell in strips across the floor, dust rising in slow golden spirals. It struck me how much of my life had been spent tending to other people's comfort, how rarely I'd allowed myself to sit without purpose. That day, sitting was the rebellion. The real turning point came later that evening. I was watching the news when the phone rang. The voice on the other end was soft but unfamiliar. "Mrs. Harlow? This is Jennifer, from Willow Pines Assisted Living. Your daughter asked me to confirm your appointment for next Tuesday." For a second, I couldn't speak. The woman repeated herself gently, assuming I hadn't heard. I thanked her, said I'd be there, and hung up. My heart was beating hard, not with panic, but with recognition. So this was her next move, to present me with a fait accompli, a tour already arranged, a new home pre-selected, my role reduced to compliance. I stood in the middle of the kitchen, staring at the neat stack of brochures she had left on the counter, and laughed quietly. It wasn't a cruel laugh. It was the sound of something long dormant waking up. I realized that I didn't need to argue with her. I didn't need to defend myself. I only needed to act. That night, I took out a box of old photographs and began sorting through them. There were pictures of me in my 20s, holding a baby Marianne on my hip, my hair dark, my smile unguarded. I studied that young woman and thought about how much she had survived. Poverty, widowhood, loneliness, and the quiet labor of keeping a life stitched together with invisible threads. That woman had been resourceful. That woman had been brave. And she was still here, under the wrinkles and the polite nods and the careful silences. I placed one photograph in my wallet as if to remind myself that the version of me capable of starting over had never disappeared, only gone underground. The following day, I went to the bank again, this time to transfer a portion of my savings into a separate account under my maiden name. The clerk didn't question it. She simply handed me the forms and a small, knowing smile. "Independence," she said, as if she could read my thoughts. "Always a good investment." I signed the papers slowly, savoring the sound of the pen against the paper. When I left the bank, the sky had turned a soft gray, the air heavy with the scent of rain. I walked the 2 blocks to a small rental office I'd noticed earlier. A young man at the desk handed me a brochure for modest apartments near the waterfront. Clean, quiet, month-to-month leases. "We don't get many seniors living alone," he said, smiling kindly. "They usually have family." I returned his smile, but didn't explain. Let them think what they want. Family isn't always the safest company. That evening, as the rain began to fall, I sat by the window in my reclaimed chair and watched the world outside blur into silver. For the first time in months, I felt a kind of peace that didn't depend on anyone else's approval. I realized that my daughter's control had thrived not because she was powerful, but because I had been too polite to challenge it. All my life I had confused compliance with love. I had taught her that my silence was affection, that my agreement was gratitude. I had made it easy for her to believe she knew best. It wasn't malice, it was learned behavior. She'd grown up watching me yield to keep the peace. And now, as an adult, she had turned that lesson into a form of domination, wrapped in care. But I wasn't her lesson anymore. When Marianne returned that Sunday, I greeted her warmly. She seemed pleased by my good mood. "You seem happy, Mom," she said, almost suspiciously. "I am," I replied, and it was true. I didn't tell her about the new account, the appointment at the rental office, or the documents secured under lock and key. She didn't notice the small, sealed envelope on my desk, addressed to Mr. Delaney, containing instructions that would ensure no legal changes could be made without my consent. She didn't notice because she wasn't looking. She believed she had already seen everything worth knowing about me. That was her blind spot. The arrogance of assumption. Over dinner, she told me about her trip, about a new promotion, about how we'll have to make some big decisions soon. She used the word "we" as if it were a kindness, not an erasure. I listened, nodded, smiled in all the right places, and when she finally paused, I said, "I think I'm ready to look at some options. I've been thinking about Portland." She frowned, caught off guard. "Portland? That's across the country." I shrugged. "I've always liked it there. Cooler weather, good libraries, kind people." She stared at me, confused. I could see her recalibrating, trying to fit this unexpected independence into her map of me. "You don't know anyone in Portland," she said. "Not yet," I answered. That ended the conversation. That night, I sat awake long after she'd gone to bed. The rain had stopped, and the air smelled of wet earth. I opened the window slightly and felt the cool air move across my face. There was fear in me, yes, but it was the kind that feels like electricity, not paralysis. The kind that means you're alive again. I thought about all the women I'd known over the years, friends, neighbors, colleagues, who had been quietly disappeared into care, their stories rewritten by well-meaning relatives. I thought of how many of them had once been fierce and capable before being renamed fragile and burdensome. I would not join their ranks. The next morning, I wrote a single line in my notebook. I choose myself. It looked strange at first, self-indulgent even, but the more I stared at the words, the more solid they became, like a contract. I made coffee, opened the curtains wide, and for the first time in a long time, didn't feel like a guest in my own house. I wasn't free yet, not entirely, but I had turned in the direction of freedom. And once a woman starts walking toward herself, no one, not even her own daughter, can stop her. The second escalation began the way most confrontations in my life have begun. Not with raised voices or slammed doors, but with the slow tightening of a noose made of polite gestures. It was 2 weeks after Marianne returned from her trip, and by then she had noticed something, though she couldn't yet name it. My compliance had become too smooth, too easy. The quiet had changed its texture. I could see it in the way she watched me while pretending not to, her gaze following my hands as I folded laundry, her pauses when I mentioned errands, her subtle glances toward the hall table where I kept my keys. Control doesn't respond well to calm rebellion. It needs friction to justify itself. My stillness unnerved her because it offered no entry point for her management. She started asking more questions: where I was going, who I was calling, what mail I was sending. I answered each one evenly, never lying, but never giving her the satisfaction of full disclosure either. It became a quiet duel conducted in the language of civility. One afternoon, she came home early and found me on the phone. I was confirming a viewing for a small apartment near Clearwater, 1 bedroom with a balcony overlooking the bay. The woman on the other end had a lilting voice and a matter-of-fact kindness I hadn't heard in a long time. "Take your time deciding," she'd said. "We don't hold units, but we don't rush people either." When I hung up, Marianne was standing in the doorway of the living room, her face carefully neutral. "Who were you talking to?" she asked. I could have told her the truth, but I didn't owe her that yet. "An old friend," I said lightly. "She's moving and might need help with some paperwork." It wasn't a lie, not entirely. I was, after all, planning to help someone move. Myself. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "You should rest more, Mom. You've been overdoing it lately. Maybe it's time we looked at that retirement place together, just so you can see it." I nodded, as if she'd suggested a walk on the beach. "Sure," I said. "We can look." I knew she wouldn't expect me to actually mean it, and in a way, I didn't. Looking wasn't agreeing. Sometimes you agree to look so that someone else will stop watching. A few days later, we drove to Willow Pines. The building was new and angular, with clean white walls and carefully landscaped courtyards meant to imitate serenity. The receptionist greeted us with the overbright cheerfulness of someone who has practiced empathy into performance. She offered us tea. Marianne accepted for both of us. We toured the model suite. Compact, spotless, silent. It smelled of disinfectant and lilacs, an artificial calm. The woman guiding us spoke of community and support and safety. Every word landed like a lid closing. I asked about privacy. Could residents lock their doors, control their visitors, choose their meals? Her smile faltered slightly. "Of course," she said, "within reason." I turned toward Marianne and said softly, "I've spent my whole life living within reason. Maybe I'm ready for something unreasonable." The guide laughed, not realizing I wasn't joking. On the drive home, Marianne filled the silence with statistics: accident rates, isolation risks, dementia onset ages. I watched the world slide past through the window, the sky a dull wash of blue, the streets all looking alike. She kept saying the word safe. It was her favorite argument. I realized then that safety is often just another name for control, the comfort of the caretaker, not the cared for. When we pulled into the driveway, I thanked her for taking me and said I needed a nap. She touched my shoulder gently, almost pityingly. "You'll see, Mom. It's for the best." That night, while she slept, I sat at the kitchen table and looked up flights. Portland again. I hadn't even been there in decades, but the thought of that distant city, rainy, green, and anonymous, gave me a strange sense of clarity. I didn't know if I would go. I only knew that I could. The next morning, she was on the phone with her husband. I overheard enough to understand. She was planning the logistics of my move. "She won't resist," she said, in the tone of someone talking about a stubborn pet finally tamed. "I think she's accepted it. Once she visits again, we'll start the paperwork." My throat tightened, not from fear, but from the quiet insult of being spoken about like a task successfully managed. I made coffee, entered the room as though I'd heard nothing, and asked if she wanted some. She looked startled, then relaxed. She didn't know that I had already decided. 2 days later, I called Mr. Delaney again. "I'd like to update the distribution clause," I told him, "to reflect some new understandings." He didn't ask questions, just set an appointment. When I left his office that Friday, everything was signed, sealed, and filed. I walked out into the sunlight, feeling weightless. It was the opposite of safety. It was freedom disguised as paperwork. That weekend, the second act of her plan began in earnest. She invited a social worker. "Just for an informal assessment," she said. "It's standard procedure." The woman arrived at noon, polite, with a clipboard and a soothing voice. Marianne hovered nearby, pretending to tidy up, but clearly listening. The questions were simple at first: name, date, address, current medications, then gradually more personal. Do you ever feel confused? Do you sometimes forget where you are? I smiled. Only when my daughter changes the furniture, I said. The woman smiled back, uncertain whether it was humor or hostility. How do you handle finances? She asked next. Manually, I said, because the computer makes mistakes. Her pen paused. Computers don't usually make mistakes, she said gently. They do when people program them to. I kept my voice even. I prefer paper. I trust things that can't be edited behind my back. Marianne stiffened, but said nothing. The assessment ended 15 minutes later. When the social worker left, Marianne tried to sound casual. You were a little defensive. Was I? I said. Maybe I'm finally learning from you. After that, the tension thickened. She began checking on me more often, calling at odd hours, insisting on accompanying me to appointments I hadn't even mentioned. One morning, she rearranged my spice cabinet and said it was for safety. Things at eye level are easier for you. I stood there watching her line up jars like soldiers, thinking how control often disguises itself as concern, and how the most efficient way to erase someone is to organize them. The breaking point came with the bank. I'd gone there to withdraw cash for my upcoming trip to Clearwater to sign the lease. The teller looked apologetic when she said, Your daughter called this morning about your joint account. She wanted to confirm your balance and transfer permissions. My heart went cold. There is no joint account, I said. The teller nodded slowly, sympathetic but bound by policy. It's listed as pending authorization. I walked out of the bank into the heat, the world too bright, and sat in the car until my breath steadied. It wasn't just intrusion anymore. It was annexation. My life was becoming territory under administrative review. That evening, I confronted her. Not angrily. That would have given her the moral high ground. I waited until dinner, until she'd poured her wine and was comfortable. I stopped by the bank today, I said casually. They mentioned a call from you. She froze mid-sip. Oh, that, she said, waving her hand. I was just trying to simplify things. It's easier to manage bills that way. I nodded. Simpler for you, yes. Her face flushed slightly. Mom, please. You're being paranoid. You've always trusted me. I looked at her for a long moment. That's true, I said. And that's how we got here. She stood abruptly, muttering something about my stubbornness, about how I make everything harder than it needs to be. I let her go. The argument wasn't the point anymore. She was trying to provoke me into confirming her story of fragility. I wouldn't give her that satisfaction. When she went upstairs, I sat in the quiet kitchen and wrote a letter to Mr. Delaney confirming my updated directives. Then I made a copy for the bank and another for my new landlord. The following morning, while she was still asleep, I packed a small suitcase, just enough for a few days. I left a note on the counter that read, Gone to visit an old friend. Don't worry. It wasn't untrue. My old friend was the part of myself she had tried to bury under good intentions. I drove to Clearwater, signed the lease, and moved in that afternoon. The apartment was small, the furniture secondhand, but it smelled of salt and possibility. There was a narrow balcony that overlooked the water and a faint hum of traffic from the distant highway. I unpacked slowly, placing my books on the shelf, my photographs on the table, my teacups in the cupboard. Every motion felt ceremonial. For the first time in months, No one corrected the placement of a single thing. That evening, my phone rang. Marianne, of course. I didn't answer. She called again, then texted, "Where are you? Are you okay?" I watched the messages pile up. First concern, then irritation, then guilt disguised as authority. "Mom, this isn't safe. You can't just disappear. We need to talk." I turned off the phone and left it on the counter. The silence that followed was enormous. Over the next few days, I settled into a rhythm. Morning walks along the bay, afternoons reading by the window, evenings spent listening to the radio. The world was still there, waiting, indifferent but generous. I hadn't felt so unobserved in years. On the 5th day, I finally called Mr. Delaney to inform him of my new address. "Good," he said. "You sound lighter?" I laughed. "I am." He paused. "You did the right thing, you know. It's never too late to take back authorship." A week later, there was a knock at the door. For a moment, I thought it might be her, but it was the landlord with a package. "Delivered to your old address," he said. Inside was a small box containing a few of my belongings I'd left behind. A framed photograph, a scarf, a pair of reading glasses. No note. I placed the photo on the shelf. It was of Marianne as a little girl, sitting on my lap, both of us laughing at something outside the frame. For a long time, I couldn't look away. There's a grief particular to mothers, the grief of surviving your child's indifference. But as I looked at that photo, I realized I no longer wanted her approval. What I wanted was peace, and peace had finally found me in the shape of my own company. Still, the story wasn't over. A week later, a letter arrived. Not from Marianne, but from her lawyer. It was phrased with professional concern. "Our client is deeply worried about your welfare. She requests confirmation that you are safe and receiving appropriate care." I read it twice, then folded it neatly and slid it into a drawer. I didn't respond. The letter was proof of my success. I had left her far enough behind that she had to outsource her control. That night, I stood on the balcony watching the lights shimmer across the bay. The air smelled of rain and jasmine. Somewhere below, a couple was laughing, the sound carrying softly upward. I realized I was no longer angry, not even hurt. What I felt was distance, vast, clean, and earned. I thought about how she had once searched, "How long can 80-year-olds live?" and I almost smiled. Because now I had my answer. Long enough to reclaim what was taken. Long enough to start again. And maybe that's what frightened her most. That love, when stripped of ownership, can survive only if it learns to let go. When I went to bed that night, I left the window open to the sea breeze. The world hummed gently beyond the glass. I fell asleep, knowing that the next time she tried to reach for me, it would be too late. Not because I'd vanished, but because I had finally returned to myself. The climax began not with confrontation, but with silence. The kind that gathers before a storm when the air grows heavy and everything alive seems to hold its breath. It was a month after I had moved into the small apartment by the bay. The days had fallen into a rhythm of stillness that felt almost sacred. I woke early, walked to the water, and let the sound of the waves rinse the noise of memory from my mind. I cooked small meals, read without guilt, and slept without listening for footsteps in the hallway. For a while, I let myself believe it was over. That distance had settled everything, that Marianne's calls would eventually thin out and disappear into the polite void that separates estranged family members who still send cards at Christmas but have stopped pretending to know each other's hearts. But love, even the distorted kind, doesn't end quietly. It mutates. It rearranges its disguise. And one morning, it arrived in the form of a knock. I opened the door to find her standing there, smaller than I remembered, her expression carefully composed. Behind her stood a man in a navy suit, her husband, or perhaps her shield. They had driven through the night, she said. She spoke softly, as if afraid a raised voice might shatter something fragile between us. "Mom," she began, "we just want to talk. You scared us." I let them in, mostly because I wanted to see how far she was willing to take this performance of concern. She looked around the apartment with thinly veiled judgment, her eyes scanning the furniture, the books, the window view, as if cataloging evidence of decline. "It's small," she said finally, forcing a smile. "Cozy." I could almost hear the subtext. Unfit, temporary, impulsive. Her husband sat stiffly on the edge of the sofa, the kind of man who prefers systems to emotions. "We're worried about you," he said. "You've been avoiding calls. Marianne's been sick with anxiety." I turned to my daughter and asked quietly, "Sick with worry or with control?" For a moment, her mask slipped. "Don't start, Mom. Please. This isn't about control. It's about safety." The word again, sharp and cold as glass. Safety. The kingdom she ruled. The justification for every trespass. I walked to the window, opened it a little, and let the breeze in. If safety means surrendering everything that makes life worth living, then I choose danger. She laughed softly, the kind of laugh that isn't amusement, but disbelief. "You sound dramatic." "I sound alive," I said. "There's a difference." She took a breath, preparing her argument. "You're 81. You can't live alone forever. It's irresponsible. What if something happens?" I turned toward her and said, "Something did happen. You stopped seeing me." That silenced her. Her husband looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight. He tried to smooth it over. "This isn't an attack. We just want a plan." I smiled at that. How tidy the word sounded, how bureaucratic. Plans are what people make when they've stopped listening to truth. Then came the envelope. She pulled it from her bag, laid it on the table, and slid it toward me like a peace offering. "It's just authorization forms," she said. "They'll make things easier. You can revoke them anytime." I didn't touch it. "You've already tried once," I said. "At the bank. I had to fix that." Her face flushed. "You misunderstood. I was trying to help." "Help whom?" I asked. "You or me?" The question hung between us like a suspended blade. For a long moment, no one spoke. The sound of the waves outside filled the silence. Finally, I walked to the cabinet, opened the drawer, and took out a thin folder, the one Mr. Delaney had prepared. I placed it on the table beside her envelope. "This," I said, "is my will, my power of attorney, my health directives. All finalized, notarized, and sealed. I've taken care of everything. You don't need to worry anymore." She blinked, confused. "You mean you—" "Yes," I said. "I already did. I'm not leaving anything unfinished, except the part where I let someone else make decisions for me." Her hands trembled as she opened the folder and saw her name. It was there, of course, but in a different position than before. I hadn't disinherited her. I'm not that kind of mother. But I had created conditions, precise and legal, that protected me from her benevolence. She looked up, her eyes wide with something between shock and betrayal. "You went behind my back," she said. "No," I answered. "You were in front of me, always in front, blocking the view." Her husband cleared his throat, trying to restore order. "This doesn't seem necessary," he said. "Families should trust each other." I turned to him with a calm so deep it surprised even me. "Trust isn't a family privilege," I said. "It's a daily decision." And she stopped making it when she Googled my expiration date. Marianne closed her eyes briefly, a flicker of shame passing over her face like a shadow. "I didn't mean it that way," she whispered. "I was scared." "Of what?" I asked. "Of me dying? Or of me living longer than you planned?" The air thickened. She began to cry, not loudly, but with the soft, steady tears of someone realizing too late that love and possession are not the same thing. I wanted to comfort her, but the part of me that had always reached for her in weakness had gone quiet. Some things need to remain unsoothed to stay true. I poured her a glass of water and handed it to her, not as a mother, not as a victim, but as a woman handing another woman the means to compose herself. "You taught me something," I said. "You taught me that control and love look similar until you look closely. I had to choose which one I wanted to live with." She wiped her eyes and said softly, "So this is it? You've shut me out." I shook my head. "No. I've opened the door. You just don't like what's on the other side." She stood then, restless, pacing. "You think this makes you free? You're just going to end up alone." I smiled at the irony. "I was already alone," I said. "Now I'm just honest about it." She stopped pacing, stared at me, and for a moment I thought she might reach out, touch my hand, say something true. But instead she said, "You've always been so stubborn." I nodded. "And you've always mistaken that for strength only when it benefited you." Her husband glanced at his watch. "We should go," he murmured. She gathered her things mechanically, her movements small and rigid. At the door she hesitated. "If you change your mind," she began. "I already have," I said gently. She nodded once, then walked out. The door closed softly, almost respectfully. The silence that followed wasn't emptiness. It was completion. I stood by the window, watching their car pull away until it turned the corner and vanished. I thought I might feel regret, or grief, or some hollow ache of finality. But what I felt instead was a slow, radiant calm. I made tea, sat by the window, and opened my notebook. The page was blank except for a line I'd written weeks before. "I choose myself." I added beneath it, "and I choose peace over permission." The next morning, I mailed a letter to Marianne. Brief, precise, not unkind. I wrote, "You don't need to manage me anymore. I'm safe. I'm where I belong. Please live your own life with as much intention as I've reclaimed in mine." I signed it simply, "Love, Mom." There was no bitterness in the ink, no accusation, only release. That afternoon, I walked along the pier. The water shimmered like glass, the gulls drifting lazily above. I passed couples, fishermen, children with ice cream cones, all of them moving in their own orbits. I realized that freedom wasn't the absence of people. It was the presence of choice. The simple act of walking where you wish, eating when you're hungry, speaking only when you have something worth saying. Later, back at the apartment, I found myself humming while washing dishes, an old song from when Marianne was a child. The melody carried through the open window, fragile but steady. For the first time, I sang it for myself. The lyrics spoke of waiting, of returning, of the promise that no one ever truly disappears while they remember who they are. That evening, I sat on the balcony as the sun sank low, staining the sky in shades of gold and rose. I thought about all the years I had spent apologizing for existing too long, for taking up space someone else wanted to rearrange. I thought of the small, defiant acts that had brought me here. Locking the safe deposit box, signing my own name, refusing to explain my solitude. Each of them, a quiet resurrection. As darkness settled, I whispered into the cooling air, not to her, not even to the world, but to myself. I am still here, and I decide what that means. The words didn't echo. They sank into the night, absorbed by everything that had once seemed indifferent and now felt alive. That was my climax. Not a battle won, not revenge or victory, but reclamation. The end of negotiation. The moment I realized I didn't need to be loved on anyone else's terms to deserve to keep living on my own. The resolution arrived not like a revelation, but like the slow settling of dust after a long storm, when everything familiar looks slightly altered, yet somehow more itself. Weeks passed after Marianne's visit, each day smoothing the rough edges of that final confrontation until what remained was something quiet and clean, almost tender. She didn't call again, at least not immediately, and I didn't expect her to. Distance has its own rhythm, and I knew we both needed to relearn how to breathe without one another's interference. The mornings belonged to me now, truly to me. I would wake before dawn, make coffee in the small percolator that hissed like a living thing, and sit by the window watching the horizon bloom in slow increments of light. The bay shimmered each day as if promising renewal. Sometimes I imagined the light as an answer to the question she had once typed into that cold search bar. How long can 80-year-olds live? And I wanted to whisper back, as long as we need to reclaim our names. I began to enjoy the ordinariness of my days, the rhythm of solitude that was not loneliness, but ownership. There was pleasure in routine, in the small acts of autonomy that I had once taken for granted. I did my own shopping, spoke to the clerks who now knew me by name, carried my groceries up the narrow staircase without anyone insisting on taking the bag from my hands. I found companionship in brief, passing encounters. The old man who sold me lemons from his garden, the librarian who saved me a copy of every new poetry book, the child who waved at me from the balcony across the street. These were not replacements for family, but reminders that connection can exist without possession. I learned again how to inhabit my own company without apology. Sometimes, in the late afternoons, I would walk to the pier where the fishermen gathered. They always left a small bench unclaimed for whoever arrived last, and I often found myself there, watching them cast their lines, their movements patient, repetitive, almost meditative. One of them, a man in his 70s named Carl, began greeting me each time. We rarely spoke more than a few sentences, but his presence felt grounding, a kind of steady witness to my quiet re-entry into the world. He would nod toward the horizon and say things like, "The tide always brings something back, even if it's not what you expect." And I would nod, knowing he wasn't talking only about the sea. At home, the space that had once felt temporary began to soften into something resembling permanence. I rearranged the furniture not for efficiency, but for comfort, hung a few paintings I had kept in storage, placed fresh flowers on the table every Sunday. These small domestic rituals became a declaration of existence, proof that I hadn't vanished into someone else's plan. Sometimes I wondered if Marianne imagined me sitting alone in the dark, fragile and waiting. If she did, then perhaps that vision comforted her, because it meant I still needed her. But the truth was simpler and far less tragic. I was living quietly, deliberately, fully. Then, one morning, a letter arrived, The handwriting was unmistakably hers, neat but hesitant, as if each word had been weighed before being released onto the page. I held the envelope for a long time before opening it. Inside was a short note, written without pretense. I don't know how to be the kind of daughter you want, but I'm trying to understand. I hope you're well. I miss you. There was no apology, no plea, no explanation. Only that fragile admission of effort. For the first time, I didn't feel the need to respond immediately. I let the words sit, breathing in the quiet sincerity that lay between their lines. Eventually, I wrote back. Understanding is enough. Love doesn't have to look like agreement. I'm well. I hope you are too. It wasn't reconciliation, not yet, but it was the beginning of something better. Recognition without ownership. That evening, I sat on the balcony as the sun bled into the water, and I thought about all the women I had known who'd been diminished by the word care. Women whose families wrapped them in tenderness so tight it smothered them, who were told that dependency was dignity, that safety was gratitude. I wished I could gather them all, every one of those invisible sisters, and tell them what I had finally learned, that love which demands your surrender is not love, and that aging does not mean vanishing. I imagined them listening, nodding, their faces lit by the same fierce, quiet fire that now lived in me. Sometimes, I still dream of Marianne as a little girl, running barefoot through the yard, her laughter a ribbon of sound in the hot summer air. In the dream, she turns to look at me, her eyes wide with trust, and I want to tell her that love isn't about holding on, but about allowing each other to remain whole. I wake from those dreams with a strange mix of sorrow and gratitude. Sorrow for what was lost in translation between us. Gratitude for the fact that I finally stopped translating myself for her. Now, as I write this, the night hums softly outside my window. The lemon tree below my balcony has begun to flower again, its blossoms small and defiant. I think of that tree often, how it survived years of neglect, drought, storms, and still found a way to bloom. Maybe survival, at this age, isn't about outlasting others, but about outlasting the version of yourself that allowed diminishment. Maybe that's the true measure of how long 80-year-olds live, not in years, but in awakenings. I keep her letter folded neatly in the drawer beside my bed. I don't reread it often, but I like knowing it's there, a quiet truce between the woman who once searched for my end and the woman who finally learned to begin again. When I think of her now, I no longer feel anger. I feel distance softened by compassion, the kind that doesn't excuse but understands. I know she'll have her own reckoning one day, the moment she realizes how easily love can blur into control, how easily care can become a cage. When that day comes, I hope she remembers me not as the mother she had to manage, but as the woman who chose to live without permission. And so I sit here, in the calm after everything, watching the last light dissolve into the bay. The air smells of salt and jasmine. Somewhere below, someone laughs, and the sound carries upward, like an echo of another life. I lift my cup of tea and whisper to the fading sky, not a prayer, but a promise. I am still here. Then I smile, because for the first time in many years, the words feel neither defiant nor defensive. They feel simply true,